You've been told a story about saying no. It goes like this: refusing someone damages the relationship. It creates conflict, disappoints people, makes you harder to deal with, harder to love, harder to keep around. Say yes whenever you possibly can, and people will like you more for it, more consistently, over time. That story is a myth, and it's a myth that quietly produces the exact opposite of what it promises to deliver. The people who say yes to everything, every single time, aren't the most respected people in any room they walk into. They're often, quietly, the least. Meanwhile, the person who can say a calm, clean no, without apologizing for it, without over-explaining it, without immediately trying to soften it into something smaller, tends to walk away from that same room with more respect attached to their name, not less. There's a precise reason for this, and it isn't random, and it isn't really about charisma either. It runs on a specific psychological mechanism that has almost nothing to do with how agreeable you manage to be, and everything to do with what a no actually proves about the person saying it. This is what your boundaries are really communicating to the people around you, whether you intend them to or not. The function a boundary actually serves. A boundary isn't really a wall in the way most people instinctively picture it, and that mental image is exactly why the entire concept gets so badly misunderstood in the first place. A boundary is information. It tells another person clearly and in advance where you end and where they begin. What's actually true for you, as a fixed fact, as opposed to what you'll merely tolerate in order to avoid friction in the moment. And information in any functioning relationship is precisely what allows two people to build something real together, instead of something built entirely on guesswork and assumption. Without boundaries, the other person is left to discover your actual limits the hard way, usually by accident, usually by crossing one without warning, usually only after some real damage has quietly already been done to the relationship. With boundaries clearly stated, they know in advance before any damage occurs. That kind of clarity isn't cold, despite how it's often framed. It's a form of respect, offered proactively before it's strictly needed, rather than demanded defensively after the fact, once resentment has already set in. Mechanism 1. A no proves your yes is real. This is the foundation that everything else in this video sits directly on top of. If someone says yes to literally everything, every single request, without exception, their yes stops carrying any real information at all. It isn't a genuine choice being made in the moment. It's a reflex, functionally indistinguishable from simple compliance, and the human brain quietly registers that difference even when it can't consciously name what it's noticing. A person who is capable of saying no is, by direct extension, a person whose yes actually means something specific, precisely because it was selected from a real, available set of options rather than handed out automatically, by default, every time. This is exactly why a favor from someone known to set real limits feels meaningfully different from the identical favor offered by someone who says yes to absolutely everyone. The first feels chosen, deliberately, in that moment, for you specifically. The second feels default, the same response that anyone, asking anything, would have received. People rarely sit down and consciously calculate any of this in real time, but they feel the weight difference instantly, almost physically, the moment a yes arrives from someone who clearly, demonstrably could have said no instead. Mechanism 2. Boundaries signal a stable internal structure. Here's something most people never consciously connect to the idea of boundaries at all. The human brain reads limits as a sign of psychological stability, not as a sign of difficulty or unpleasantness. A person without any boundaries reads, underneath the pleasant surface, as a person without a fixed shape of their own. Someone who continuously reorganizes themselves around whoever happens to be standing in front of them at the time. That's genuinely unsettling to be around for any sustained period, even when it superficially looks accommodating and easy, because there's ultimately nothing stable underneath to actually rely on. You simply can't predict, with any confidence, someone who has no fixed form to begin with. A person with clear, consistently held limits reads as having an internal structure that doesn't shift depending on the room they're standing in or who happens to be asking. That predictability is precisely what the human brain has always equated with safety, going back long before modern relationships, modern workplaces, or modern friendships existed in anything like their current form. You know exactly where they stand. You know, with real confidence, what they'll tolerate and what they categorically won't. That knowledge, somewhat paradoxically to most people, makes others feel genuinely more at ease around someone who will occasionally, calmly, tell them no. Not less at ease, despite every instinct suggesting otherwise. Mechanism 3. A boundary communicates self-respect, and self-respect is contagious. People take their behavioral cues for how to treat someone, in large part, directly from how that person visibly treats themselves. Someone who consistently overrides their own limits, who says yes while visibly resenting it underneath, who agrees out loud while their tone, posture, and energy are quietly saying the opposite, is broadcasting a continuous, instructive signal to everyone around them. My limits are negotiable, even to me, even when I'm the one holding them. People absorb that instruction over time, often without ever consciously realizing they've absorbed anything at all, and they start treating the stated limits accordingly, with less and less weight attached to them. Someone who holds a boundary calmly, without drama attached, and without a trailing apology, broadcasts the precise opposite instruction instead. This is real, it's stable, and it applies consistently, regardless of who's asking or how the request is framed. That second instruction gets absorbed just as readily as the first one does. Respect, in the overwhelming majority of relationships, is rarely directly requested out loud. It's modeled first through consistent behavior and then mirrored back almost automatically by the people around you. Mechanism 4. The cost of conflict. Avoidance is paid later with interest. This is the mechanism that finally explains why so many committed people pleasers end up quietly resentful, chronically exhausted, or eventually explosive in ways that seem to come from nowhere. Despite years and years of genuinely trying to keep everyone around them comfortable at real cost to themselves, every boundary that goes unspoken doesn't simply disappear once the moment passes. It gets stored somewhere, quietly, in the background. And stored resentment doesn't stay perfectly still once it's accumulated. It compounds over time, and it eventually surfaces, usually at a moment almost entirely disconnected from its actual original cause, often attached to something disproportionately small and seemingly trivial on the surface. This is precisely why a sudden outburst can look so confusing from the outside to anyone watching it happen. Why are they reacting like this over something so genuinely minor? The honest answer, almost every time, is that the visible trigger was rarely the real underlying cause. It was simply the final entry recorded in a much longer ledger that had been quietly running for a long time, completely unspoken the entire way through, line after unrecorded line. A boundary stated early, calmly, and directly costs a small, manageable amount of immediate discomfort in the moment it's said. A boundary withheld instead costs considerably more later on, and it gets paid out eventually in a form that damages the relationship far more severely than the original simple no ever would have, had it just been said plainly the first time it was needed. What a healthy no actually sounds like. It's worth being genuinely precise here, because boundaries have earned something of a harsh reputation in popular conversation, and that reputation is usually the fault of bad examples, rather than any flaw in the underlying principle itself. A boundary that actually works in practice doesn't require a lecture, a bulleted list of justifications, or a lingering apology tour stretched across several follow-up messages. I can't take that on right now. That doesn't work for me. Said plainly, without flinching, and without unnecessary over-explaining, these land cleanly as simple settled facts. Said instead with 3 full paragraphs of justification and a visibly guilty tone attached, the exact same words start to sound less like a fact and more like the opening move of a negotiation, and, almost inevitably, an open invitation to be gently talked out of it after all. The clarity itself is the respect being offered. Over-explaining quietly undercuts that same respect by signaling, often unintentionally, that the boundary actually needs the other person's permission to legitimately exist in the first place. Here's the architecture sitting underneath everything in this video. A no was never really a rejection of the other person, however it might initially feel to either side in the moment it's spoken. It's a small piece of accurate information about you specifically, current, honest, and offered directly, instead of being withheld indefinitely until it eventually leaks out sideways, much later, in a far less honest and far more damaging form. People don't actually respect raw agreeableness nearly as much as the conventional story insists they do. What they consistently respect, underneath the surface, is predictability, visible self-respect, and the quiet, ongoing evidence that someone's yes, when it finally arrives, was a real and considered choice rather than an automatic reflex. A boundary, stated plainly and held consistently over time, supplies all three of those things simultaneously, in a single clean gesture. So here's the question worth genuinely sitting with after everything laid out above. Somewhere in your life, right now, there's very likely a yes currently sitting on your tongue that you don't actually mean, that you're about to say anyway, out of simple habit. What is it actually costing you to keep saying it every single time? And what might genuinely change in how people treat you the moment you finally, calmly, don't?